This is your weekly astrology forecast, and I'm Laura Chung. Welcome back. And no, this is not Mercury retrograde. I am posting this midweek, so a little later than usual, but I had a very good reason, and I wanted to prioritize my rest and rejuvenation because a lot of things were happening in the world and it was affecting my sleep and it was affecting my mental health. And I'm sure most of you can relate. I felt very overstimulated and I felt like I was crashing out. A lot of these astrology transits were impacting me personally. So I had to prioritize my rest, but here I am. So let's just get straight into the recap. I'm not going to be able to share everything that happened. I'm just going to give the highlights based on what I mentioned last week, which really at the top of everybody's mind in the US is that on June 6th, when Venus ingressed into the sign of Taurus, it was starting to form a square to Pluto in Aquarius. There were ice raids across Los Angeles, and there were anti-ice protests that started that are continuing to today. Today, I'm filming this on June 12th. And yeah, I think, anytime you have a planet that ingresses into a new sign, especially at the 0 degree, this is a very critical, it's the critical degree in astrology, but because Venus, which is normally like a sweet transit, I think I even mentioned that last week, because Venus is in its domicile in Taurus. It's all about resources and embodiment and sensuality. But it was starting to form a square to Pluto in Aquarius, which is the transit that really started to perfect this week. Now, on June 8th, Mercury ingressed into the sign of Cancer, and the morning of June 9th, so early morning local time in Gaza, this was when the Madeleine, the Freedom Flotilla, was intercepted by the Israeli occupation. Now, this Freedom Flotilla was protected by international law in international waters, as Gaza is part of Palestinian territory. And these 12 activists were unharmed. They were just bringing food. I think they mentioned specifically baby formula, crutches, and just like enough aid so that they could break the blockade and open up a humanitarian corridor for other possible flotillas to come in. Now, I mentioned in last week's forecast that every flotilla previous to this one since 2010 was bombed, and essentially those flotillas never made it onto the shores of Gaza. And every chart always had Mars in Leo because Israel's natal chart has Mars at 28 degrees of Leo. So actually, right now in the sky, Israel is going through its Mars return. And Mars is the planet of war and aggression. And so natally, Israel has a Sun and Mars square. So this is like how it shows up in their chart, like the right to defend themselves. I say that in air quotes because obviously. Um, so I thought that was interesting because Mercury ingressed into a cardinal sign at the world point, and that's when, Mercury is the planet of communication, right? That's when it kind of was like broadcast into the world that their their flotilla was intercepted by the Israeli occupation. And because Greta Thunberg, who is a very famous climate activist, was on board, and also they had been filming their entire journey and it had the attention of the international stage, they didn't end up like, they ended up throwing or like shooting some kind of white substance that they never really said what it was, but they ended up being intercepted and then taken, essentially kidnapped and put into a detention center. Since then, as of today, June 12th, all of the activists have been released, and now they're being deported to their respective countries that they came from. But I thought that was interesting because as Mercury ingressed into Cancer, it was already starting to form a square to Saturn and Neptune in the sign of Aries, and Aries represents the military. And it was, it was intercepted. So I'm sharing the astrology because obviously you don't need astrology to see that these 12 activists were going against an occupation. But I just wanted to see how this would manifest because there were very positive things about the astrology of last week. Now, they were supposed to arrive in Gaza 2 days earlier on June 7th, but because they were they were assisting some refugees in at sea. I think that's why they were delayed 2 days and arrived on June 9th, because the astrology of June 9th was very interesting. So June 9th, Mercury in Cancer was square to Saturn in Aries at 0 degrees. So that was the transit that ultimately intercepted the Madeleine. Venus in Taurus square Pluto in Aquarius at 3 degrees. So Venus in Taurus again is like resources and food, and then square to an oppressive regime, Pluto in Aquarius. And then Mercury in Cancer was square to Neptune in Aries at 2 degrees. This was also the day, later in the day, that Jupiter ingressed into the sign of Cancer. Now, Jupiter is debilitated in the sign of Gemini, and it was at the anaretic 29th degree, which I'm calling now the crash out degree. So when they were intercepted and then ultimately captured, Jupiter wasn't in Cancer yet. So I think that also made a difference that, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Jupiter ultimately, again, who knows? Because I think a lot of us, best case scenario was that they would make a lot of noise on this journey. They would at least get to the shores of Gaza to be able to distribute the aid. And then the worst case scenario was obviously being bombed by a drone. So, best case scenario, nobody died, nobody was unalived. That was like, I think, the benefic presence of Venus in Taurus, and also Jupiter going into the sign of Cancer. But ultimately, with those squares, they were intercepted by the occupation. So I think what's going to end up happening is more and more people are possibly going to try going on their own flotilla. Hopefully, like this is like the best case scenario. And more flotillas will maybe make their way to sail to Gaza. But I think because these 12 activists were unarmed, it was a humanitarian aid mission that was protected by international law. And I think people are now really seeing the occupation for what it is. It's like, why are you stopping 12 unarmed activists for delivering baby formula and food? You know what I mean? I think it's starting to unveil the reality, the true nature of the occupation, which I think is the benefic presence of the two benefics of Venus and Jupiter. On June 11th, Mercury in Cancer sextile Venus in Taurus. So yesterday, I think that was, or like between June 9th and June 11th was when they started to release the people, the activists, from their essentially like Israeli prison. And then with the ICE raids, you just saw so many people in LA coming out and protesting. Now, I find this very interesting because California before 1850 was a part of Mexico. And I don't remember if I mentioned this on my Neptune episode with Camille Michelle Gray. And we were texting this morning because I wrote it down in the notes. I just don't remember if I said it. But when Neptune was discovered in 1846, that was the same year America, at the time, what America was, declared war on Mexico because the president at the time, James Polk, kept wanting to buy Mexico from Mexico at the time, but they were like, no. And then they officially declared war in the America Mexican War of 1848 is when it started. And that was when Neptune was in Pisces. And then officially in 1850, California, Mexico ceded California, well, essentially stole. Come on, let's just be real. Like these words of like annex and ceded, it's like they really just stole Mexico from Mexico. They really stole, see, I'm saying it right now. They stole California from Mexico. And in 1850, Saturn was in Aries. So California is going through its Saturn return. And I think it's interesting because I feel like what's going to happen in the next couple of years when Uranus goes into Gemini, officially starting in 2026, and Neptune goes into Aries, and, all of these outer planets are going into air and fire signs. I I mean, I think the US is going to break apart. I think it as a country, the United States of America is going to break off into sections. And I can see how California would be the first one, if not Texas, because California is like, I think the fourth richest, like, entity, because it's not a country, right? It's a state. It's the fourth, like, highest GDP in the world. They can sustain itself without the United States. So I'm just wondering if during this Saturn return of California and Uranus and Gemini, which is the USA's Uranus return of the breaking apart of the Union, and obviously Pluto and Aquarius, which is rhyming with the American Revolution and that time, it's it's just giving that vibe because when Neptune was discovered in 1846, this was during the 19th century, like, spiritual revival of manifest destiny. And the white settlers, the white European settlers at the time said it was our God-given right to expand westward. And that is what then ultimately they purchased Louisiana from the French, and then they kept like colonizing and taking parts of Mexico to then where California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas was first. I think Texas was 1845, and so I'm wondering if all of that land is going to start to break apart. And I feel like that is the prediction that I'm gonna just state officially here. And yeah, I'm gonna do more research into all of that. But I do think that's interesting that California, specifically Southern California, LA, has gone through first the wildfires earlier this year, and also California is going through its Pluto return because it has Pluto at 4 degrees of Aquarius. So all of these returns that California is going through. And then yesterday on June 11th, there was a full moon in Sagittarius at 20 degrees. And this was at 3:45 a.m. Eastern time. And the ruler of the moon was an exalted Jupiter in Cancer that just entered Cancer. And the United States is a Sagittarius rising with a Jupiter in Cancer and a Cancer stellium in the 8th house. And like I mentioned before, Jupiter in Cancer is at a basic level very auspicious and lucky and abundant and fertile. But when it's present in a chart like the United States, it just expands more of the shadow aspects of Cancer, which in this case is nationalism and this is my home, you don't belong here. Meanwhile, like, nobody's illegal on stolen land, and those people actually are indigenous to that land if California used to be a part of Mexico. Do you know what I mean? And this whole country was is made up of immigrants. I'm a child of immigrants. My parents came here to make a better life for themselves post US imperialism in Korea. So, yeah, I just feel like you can't tell people not to be here when this isn't your land to begin with. So, I definitely think that the shape and the identity and the way in which we see the United States today on June 12th, 2025 is drastically going to change in a couple of years from now. So the only real astrology forecast prediction or like looking forward is for June 15th. And I think it's worth talking about because on June 15th, which is this weekend, Mars and Leo will square Uranus and Taurus at 28 degrees. So if you remember back last summer around July 15th, this was when Mars and Uranus came together in a conjunction. And I believe the conjunction was at 26 degrees, if I'm not mistaken. And this was also conjunct the fixed star Algol. And remember, then on July 13th, Donald J. Trump at his, I guess, rally had an assassination attempt. Now, whether you believe that assassination attempt was real or not, I guess, like, you know, it doesn't matter at this point, but it happened, right? And he kind of used that moment to make himself this hero, this, like, I don't know what I honestly don't know what goes through that man's mind. He's a Gemini. And actually the full moon that happened yesterday is his full moon because he was born during a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. So his nodes are, I believe, at 21 degrees. I think his sun and moon are both at 21, Gemini and Sag. So this is his full moon. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this weekend on his birthday on June 14th. And I did a whole TikTok video about this, and I posted it on YouTube, and so you could go watch that. But just really briefly, Trump is going through his Mars return. I think he has Mars at 26 Leo, but his ascendant is at 29. And your ascendant is your body, it's your physical body, it's your being. And he has his midheaven at 24 Taurus. So Uranus is at his midheaven, right? Shock and awe on his his legacy and his public appearance is squaring to his Mars and his ascendant, his body. So again, I'm not saying or predicting his demise, but the astrology is just so literal sometimes. And just for you personally, at the individual level, if you have personal planets or angles in and around, like, I would give it like 25 to 29 degrees of Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, or Aquarius, I would just be very careful. Now, you have to live your life. Like, you can't put your head under the sand and ignore life. But if I know that these things are happening astrologically, I'm not going to do something that is out of the realm of my normal routine. Like, this isn't a day that I would take a risk. This isn't a day that I would get a tattoo. This isn't a day that I would get like any like needlework done or anything that's risky. Like, I would just do my normal routine, and I would just try to be very careful and wary of my surroundings. That's all I'm trying to say. Because then the same day on June 15th, there's another square, Jupiter in Cancer square Saturn in Aries at 1 degrees. Now, this is the square that we've been talking about all month. Jupiter in Cancer at the end of the day is exalted, right? Jupiter is on its throne. Something wants to expand in your Cancer whole sign house, something wants to grow and be birthed. However, Saturn in Aries is in an overcoming square, and Saturn is fallen in Aries. So Saturn has the upper hand here. Saturn is like, wait a minute, before you grow this thing, this is like something that you should consider. Is it worth your time and commitment? Is it worth all of this work? Like, do you really want to do this? And so, not to be a Debbie Downer in all the excitement of Jupiter and Cancer, but this could be a little bit of like a womp womp moment, especially this weekend. So, with Mars squares, with Mars activations, I would give this June, even today, like June 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, until the square separates on June 16th, to be very careful. Now, the positive or the light attributes of how Mars and Leo square Uranus and Taurus could be is to break through a habit that's been holding you back, because Uranus has been trying to break you free and liberate you from your Taurus whole sign house since 2018. So for 7 years, it's like it's stuck. We're stuck here. It's like unmovable because it's like a fixed earth sign. And Uranus is like completing its transit through Taurus. It's going to move into Gemini on July 7th. In the fall, all of these planets are going to move back because the retrograde, and then in 2026 they're going to be there. So this is like a little taste of what that transit will be about. But just think of what your Taurus house is. Like, where's Taurus in your chart? For example, if you have an Aries rising, Taurus is your second house of finances and your own resources. Have you felt stuck? Like, are you stuck in poverty consciousness? Are you stuck in scarcity mentality? Uranus has been trying to liberate you and maybe understand how this might be something that you inherited from your ancestors, your parents, and it's time to break free and say, okay, maybe abundance is not money, but abundance is an embodiment. It's something that I feel versus something physical. You know what I mean? So having this activation of Mars in Leo too, which is like bravery and courageousness, it's like, I'm finally going to do something. I'm finally going to take action. So this is how you can positively use the Mars square Uranus. These transits always aren't like monumentally bad and apocalyptic, but again, for some people they might be, just because they're on your personal placements. And Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Aries, we've gone through this several times throughout 2023 to 2024 when Jupiter was in Gemini and Saturn was in Pisces. And so, again, Jupiter is about expansion and growth, and Saturn is like, wait a minute, we need to like take a moment and see if this is like worth my time, because we only have so much time, right, in our lives. It's the one resource that we cannot get back. But I think this is helpful for people because it makes you pause for a moment and asks you what you really want. Like, what is it that you want to grow and accomplish? And in my monthly forecast with Stephanie Campos, I use the example of an oyster in a pearl in an oyster, where the pearl is something that is like, it grows through the grit of sand. And that's the Jupiter in Cancer. Something beautiful in your life is going to manifest. But with Saturn and Aries, it's something that might be annoying. It's something that ultimately might have to leave your life, or something that you have to sacrifice in order for something to grow. So, that is the astrology forecast for this week. Again, my apologies for being a little tardy. But as always, I so appreciate all of you for liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing. And I will see you next week.